I'm delighted to be here, of course. And as Sorrell pointed out last night, as Kent got older, he was fond of saying he's delighted to be anywhere. I'm picky. So I am especially delighted to be here. I'm grateful for this opportunity to participate in a celebration of a man whom I love tremendously and whose work I so admire. It's been unsettling these past 5 years, as I'm sure it's been for all of you, to reconcile just how irreplaceable Kent's remained in our lives. And yet I meet people all the time who tell me how thrilled they are to have just met him and how at home they feel at Holt, Colorado. So we have the solace of his novels for the readers who are meeting him for the first time and for those of us who love to revisit our old friend. As Kathy indicated in my bio, I first met Kent in the spring of 2000 in Santa Fe at the Mountains and Plains Booksellers Award. He was receiving the Fiction Award for Plainsong, his third novel, and I the Nonfiction Award for my first book, a memoir entitled Where Rivers Change Direction. I am by temperament a shy man, an introvert, insecure about many things, and so the prospect of appearing in public at an award ceremony and having to assume some responsibility for a book I'd written was unnerving. Doubly so, because I'd read and admired The Tie That Binds and Where You Once Belonged, had been that very year devastated, unwound by the quiet power of Plainsong. Now I was going to meet the guy who'd written them. Then Jim Harrison was there to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, and his early comic novels had been favorites of mine, and then there was Delva and The Road Home, which were extraordinary, and Letters to Yisanan, and The Theory and Practice of Rivers, his wonderful collections of poetry. So because the award required me to appear on the same stage with Jim and Kent, writers who I knew to be out of my league, whose work I idolized, I felt especially inadequate. Sure, I would prove an embarrassment, and my insecurities didn't stop after the banquet. Afterward, Jim invited Kent and I to join him in his hotel room, where we found not only Jim, but his publisher and publicist and a small group of admirers congregated around a cardboard box filled with liquor. So over the next half dozen hours or so, Kent and I valiantly tried to keep up with Jim as he held forth on the balcony outside his room. As far as drinking went, compared to Jim at least, I proved inadequate there as well. My memory's not precise enough to recall whether I met all of Kent's family in Santa Fe that weekend, or whether it was over the span of the next several years, but what I am certain of is that I've never been acquainted with such generous people. Kathy, of course, has become my sister. Mark and Kathy siblings as well, and Vern and Edith and Brian, always so kind, so attentive, and Kent's daughters have always been so welcome, keen to make me feel accepted into their family, indeed treasured. So in spite of all my misgivings, the weekend turned out absolutely wonderfully. But after my wife Virginia and I returned to Wyoming, the memories of it seemed more fantasy than real, merely a dream in which I'd met two great writers who had, against all odds, not treated me like a poseur, and in which I'd met a family who embraced me as one of their own. I doubt I would have encouraged the friendship, though. I was too insecure then, too starstruck, too worried that if I called Kent to say how much I'd enjoyed meeting him, or wrote to express how pivotal reading The Tie That Binds had been for me, how the book had made me less self-conscious about wanting to write about the West, and how reading Plainsong had elevated what I imagined a domestic novel could accomplish. Well, I was fearful that my admiration might be viewed as as some sort of pandering, that he might imagine that I was trying to gain his friendship so that he could somehow assist me in my career. But, as in most things, my fears say far more about me than they do anyone else. Kent called the very next week. He'd read where rivers changed direction immediately on returning home, and he went on at some length about what he considered its merits to be. In truth, I think he always saw more than that book than it owns. But what was most remarkable was at the end of our conversation, he simply stated that he knew for certain he and I were going to be very good friends. So many of you here knew Kent and knew him well. But I wonder sometimes, did we know the same man? I didn't know him as a boy, a preacher's kid in eastern Colorado, or when he was in the Peace Corps in Turkey, or as a father of young girls, or a student, or a middle school teacher, or a college professor, or even as a struggling writer. I knew Kent as a middle-aged man and as a celebrated writer. Plain Song had been nominated for the National Book Award. I knew a man who could afford to move back to his beloved Colorado, to Salida, and write full-time. Lucky for me, I got Kent full-time because of that. I knew a generous man, hardworking, self-deprecating, genuinely humble man, grateful for the challenges in his life, who loved his family deeply, indeed, loved everyone he included as extended family. So, of course, in everything that mattered, I knew exactly the same man that you did. Virginia and I only visited a couple of times here at Salida, but through the years, Kent and I made sure to accept offers to speak at the same writing conferences so that we could see one another, and we managed several week-long driving trips. Eastern Colorado, so he could show me the landscape and the small towns that had inspired his novels. And there was a week in Wyoming at a conference our editor at Knopf had put together, and on which Kent got bucked off a horse and hurt his hand, and was so delighted to be the kind of writer out getting bucked off a horse and hurting his hand. And then there was a road trip a few years later when he and I drove around Wyoming and South Dakota and Nebraska to have a look at things we found interesting. I have a number of photographs of him from that last trip, my favorite being of him posing in front of Crazy Horses Memorial at Fort Robinson. It was an autumn day, very much like today. The air was dry and crisp and clear. While Kent was thinner, he'd had a tumor removed from below his stomach and couldn't eat everything he wanted to. His character remained undiminished, still welcoming and generous and funny and curious, and always so deeply thoughtful. And of course, there were the hundreds of hours we spent on the phone. We held nearly identical views about the responsibilities one owes to family, community, to society. We agreed precisely about politics and art. And for the most part, the writers we admired, and for the most part, the writers we found disappointing. And of course, writing is such a peculiar life with its incumbent stretches of isolation, the always present bouts of self-doubt, the constant weathering of criticism, the demands of trying to continually improve one's craft and never quite getting there. Well, it was wonderful to have another writer to talk to about all of that. So this morning, while I'll be speaking about Kent and Kent's work, I'll also be speaking more generally about writing. I'll be talking to you about what Kent and I talked about. We talked about words. We talked about how something as obvious as vocabulary could expand or reduce the range of imagination. How, for instance, if you only knew the word blue, to express a particular shade of the color spectrum, not aquamarine or azure or turquoise or teal or sapphire or a dozen more, how limiting that would be, and how, if the only option you had to explain your feelings when upset was to state that you were bummed, how frustrating it would be to have feelings of disillusionment, of exasperation, of disappointment, of grief, and be unable to express them. And how, as writers, how necessary it was for us to find precise vocabularies when telling our stories, how each character, each scene, each narrative arc, each novel deserved its own vocabularies. And we agreed that the value of a word does not end with its meaning, that each word owns its own peculiar valence, its different veracity, and that accumulatively in sentences and paragraphs that rhythms emerge, musical phrases emerge, indeed inform the reader past the meaning of the words. Wittgenstein wrote that the limits of my language are the limits of my mind. All I know is what I have words for. And while I believe he was right, when I'm thinking about how Kent specifically felt about words and their rhythms, the quote that comes to mind most often is Norman Maclean's "Eventually, all things merge into one, and a river runs through it, runs over the rocks from the basement of time, and under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs." Verlin Klinkenborg wrote a plain song that it was a novel so foursquare, so delicate and lovely, that it has the power to exalt the reader. I would argue that Klinkenborg's observation is true of every one of Kent's books. Kent trusted his readers. He trusted that we preferred exaltation over explanation, over exposition. He felt that if he did his job well in revealing his characters, the difficulties that they faced and overcame or did not, that if his fictions were portrayed just honestly, accurately, delicately enough, that the complications of subtext would become apparent without him ever having to point them out. In fact, they would become inevitable. He believed that if his stories were emotionally available to and able to affect readers who'd never visited eastern Colorado, that his very place-specific novels could attain a certain universality, indeed merge themselves with their readers' life experiences, no matter where the reader might be from. Ursula Le Guin wrote, "I find that Haruf's characters like Pierre and Natasha and Huck Finn inhabit my mind permanently. They are people I think about. Haruf handles human relationships with fierce, reticent delicacy, exploring rage, fidelity, pity, honor, timidity, the sense of obligation. He deals with complex, barely stated moral issues, pushing perhaps toward an unspoken mysticism." An interviewer once asked Kent's editor at Knopf what he particularly looked for in a writer whose work he hoped to acquire, and given the variety of voices Kent's editor had published, Ray Carver, Annie Dillard, Cormac McCarthy, Jay McInerney, I thought his answer a revelation. "I look for writers whom it is impossible to disbelieve," he said. "Writers who write with authority." Here was this man, Tom Guthrie, and Holt, standing at the back window in the kitchen of his house, smoking cigarettes and looking out over the back lot where the sun was just coming up. Here was this man, Tom Guthrie, and Holt. Not just anywhere or elsewhere or any man, but a particular man right here in Holt, and about whom, as readers, we care immediately. That's authoritative writing. And fiction, as Kent would have it from the film we just saw, is truer than truth. a shaped and organized kind of truth, I think he said. And therein, I think, lies the real truth of what great novelists are about. Fiction isn't just a story someone made up. It's distillation, compression, an artistic realignment of the most poignant circumstances of our lives. A well-wrought fiction allows us to enter the lives of others, to identify with others, empathize with them, with their experiences, with their realities, in ways we can't normally accomplish. When we lose ourselves in a novel that is honestly exploring the human condition, and not some genre caricature of the way we truly are, we have in that moment of transcendence, I think, become better than ourselves. When we as readers are suspended in a narrative dream of a great novel, we are ever changed by that experience. Lawrence and Miller changed the way we speak and feel about our sexuality. Tolstoy and Kazantzakis and Dickens, our thoughts about tyranny, personal and governmental alike. Wright and Twain and Faulkner, our views of racism, Welty and Whitman and Haruf, about how we conceptualize ourselves within the greater family of man, did. Toni Morrison, in her Nobel lecture, wrote about the power of language, be it grand or slender, burrowing, blasting, or refusing to sanctify, whether it laughs out loud or is a cry without an alphabet, the choice word, the chosen silence, unmolested language surges toward knowledge, not its destruction. But who does not know of literature banned because it is interrogative, discredited because it is critical, erased because alternate? Word work is sublime because it is generative. It makes meaning that secures our differences, our human difference, the way in which we are like no other. So it seems Wittgenstein was right all along. Language, stories, illuminate and complicate our imaginations, define how we imagine ourselves in the world. There's now, in fact, a body of evidence indicating that without an understanding of language and of story, we're less able to function effectively in the world. And that those of us who are tragically limited in our understanding of language are also limited in our sense of self, of place, of motive. In a recent interview in Time magazine, Jonathan Franzen made the observation that he felt books can do things that other media cannot, and further commented, as did the philosopher Kierkegaard, that a state of constant distraction simply allows people to avoid difficult realities and to maintain self-deceptions. That is, to be less thoughtful, less introspective, less self-aware, less Kant-like. And certainly with the help of cell phones and email and handheld games, all to which I'm addicted, by the way, it's easier to stay simply busy in today's world in the sense of which Kierkegaard spoke than it ever has been. Mr. Franzen also stated that we are so distracted by and engulfed by the technologies we've created and by the constant barrage of so-called information that comes our way that more than ever, to immerse yourself in an involving book seems socially useful. The place of stillness that you have to go to write, but to also read seriously, is the point where we can actually make responsible decisions, where we can actually engage productively with what is otherwise a rather scary and unimaginable world. I often hear people say that they read only nonfiction, the implication being that there's not much point in reading fiction because it's, well, made up. And yet, It's in the world of a novel, I believe, where we can best discover and empathize with the subtle differences between people, between a person and his or her own conscience. The Israeli novelist and journalist David Grossman stated that between the two, journalism and literature, that it's literature that is his primary function as an activist, pointing out that social rhetoric usually only succeeds in creating an ideology of belligerence that ultimately destroys one's humanity. And further, that while war, occupation, and political turmoil could easily fill novel after novel, they also, Grossman feels, squeeze out the private spaces of domestic life and of our individual imaginations. During Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, Grossman was based in a Lebanese village. And at night, he would take off his helmet and flak jacket and climb onto a roof where he was vulnerable to enemy fire to read chapters of Romain Gary's Promise at Dawn to, as he stated, remember who he was before the war, and to prove to himself that literature could protect him. Not save his life, certainly, but protect his soul by not allowing the situation to confiscate what was important to him. To further illustrate his argument for fiction, Grossman evoked a scene from Madame Bovary, in which Emma and her lover, unable to find a place in town to be alone, have themselves driven around the streets in a closed carriage, where they make love. And all the townspeople know about it. Grossman states, when you read Flaubert, you're with this couple, inside the carriage, and you know all their torments of bigamy and passion, all the temptations, the guilt, and you're totally prey to their passions. But if you just read about it in the papers, a journalist's assessment of the carriage passing, you're only in the people in the town simply pointing a finger at them. It's a remarkable difference, isn't it? And finally, on this bend, the novelist Amos Oz made an observation I know Kent would have loved. He said that he felt there was no line between a national condition and the human condition, and that he believed the essence of great literature is that the more parochial it is, the more universal. He was saying stories that accurately represent the commonalities of our living and dying. Stories, say, set in a little town in Holt, Colorado, are stories that more effectively break down our notions of exclusivity, of believing that our individual experiences are somehow unique, that our individual lives are somehow more important than the lives of others because they're so incomprehensible. Each time I've read Ursula Le Guin's assertion that Kent's novels push toward an unspoken mysticism, I'm reminded that literature was Kent's religion. He was a man who believed in the cultural and spiritual efficacy of art with the same devotion that others offer at church. He believed that music, theater, film, the visual arts, but especially literature, provide for us something akin of a dream time. That is an inspirational blueprint of what it means to be human, and more importantly, a template of how we might yet evolve in our empathy for others. He believed that it is art's responsibility to prompt, to question, to celebrate, and that literature exists primarily as a means to express the intricacies of our souls. And while it's not uncommon for writers, we all know many of them, to egoistically imagine themselves as priests, men and women whose job it is to translate the complexity of living to the uninformed, the less thoughtful, the unaware, Kent viewed writing from a more Gnostic point of view. He believed that if you were gifted with the curse of having to write, then the doing of it should be approached with reverence. He believed a writer should be the absolute embodiment of humility, grateful for the manner in which he or she is obliged to live their lives, viewing the profession as a devotional commitment, the writer as accolade, the practice of writing as prayer. I once wrote a line that stated that I go to the sound of water to remember that God is not mute. Kent, I think, went to the pages of books, Hemingway, Faulkner, and Chekhov, particularly to remind himself that his prayers should always be conducted with earnestness and candidly. And while all fine writers own an ear for dialogue, a penchant for narrative, and inquisitiveness about the complexities of character, feel in their bodies the rhythmic vibration of sentences when they become musical, most of us are not able to write like Kent Haruf. Because, you'll find out, I will say. Because we're unwilling to delve deeply enough into our cores, face our most basic fears, reconcile the multitude of our inhumanities, and then confess them to the world. For most of us, our egos stand in the way. Kent wrote without ego. It'd be funny if I cried here after holding it together in this memorial service. He understood how very alike he was to every other man, woman, child, and was far less interested in relating the tragedies and comedies of those around him than he was exploring and then revealing the aspects of himself. They came down the plank steps out of the trailer into the bright sun in the middle of the morning and rounded the corner in the packed dirt and arrived at the rusted shopping cart that waited like something patient and abiding among the dry cheatgrass and pigweed. Who else put pigweed, cheatgrass, abiding, and patient in his name? Kent wrote of men and women shouldering on through their personal tragedies, their daily obligations, portraying these two characters, Luther and Betty, with such dignity that it was though he were introducing us to the arrival of gods. In the week between Christmas and New Year's, they passed the long afternoons in the shed beside the alley. It was very cold in the shed, and the sunlight came in only thinly from the single window. They lit candles on the table and the back shelf, and they had blankets. For greater warmth, they took to lying beside each other on the carpet in the patch of sunlight that fell in through the window. Such a sensual scene. So available to our emotions. We recognize everything there. It's right on the edge of passion, yet so plaintive, so rich in complexity, and yet rift with this fundamental yearning. You feel their yearning. And like so many of Kent's scenes, so archetypal, that it carries with it, again, a near mythic authority. Who? Finally here, this is the witness. He held on to his brother's hand and looked out through the crowd toward the pastures and the blue sand hills beyond. The hills lay far away in the distance on the low horizon. The wind had started up again. He could feel it now. He looked again at his brother and pulled the canvas coat up over his blood-smeared face. He knelt for a long while beside him, not moving. An old man with his old brother scuttled down in the loose dirt of a plank corral under an overcast October sky. The use of the three declarative sentences as the hinge in that scene make the grief inescapable and universal, broadening the perspective. The hills lay far away in the distance on the low horizon. The wind had started up again. Those observations pull the reader's focus away from the two old men for a moment. One alive, the other just then dead, out to the hills, the horizon, the wind, a place that could be found anywhere and everywhere. And then Kent brings us back down again to the cows, and the blood, and the loose dirt. And again, it becomes so intimately personal. I remember the day Kent called me about the incident that prompted that scene. He was weeping when I picked up the phone. He told me about an article he read about two old bachelor brothers living together on an isolated farm in Iowa, I believe it was, and how one of them had died in an accident. And I remember Kent asking through his tears, "Oh, other old man get on without his brother?" Kent had a fondness for them. They show up in his books again and again, at times idealized, but for the most part they're simply people trying so desperately to live up to their potential, or at the very least to come to peace with their inadequacies. He expects a lot from his old men, and he gets a lot out of them. And he loved to portray children at about 10 or so, that age of beginning agency, but still so caged in their innocence. And he often wrote of the resiliency and level-headedness of women at any age. Edith Goodenow, Victoria Rabener, Maggie Jones, Annie Moore. And Kent could have set his books anywhere. Certainly, for a novelist, the landscape you know intimately provides a certain shorthand. But I think he specifically set his dramas in eastern Colorado because he knew that a silent and unbroken sweep of land would help his characters become better contemplative about their estrangements, their entanglements. I think he felt that their isolation would urge them toward introspection, and finally, for us as readers, unmask them for us. On our road trips, I was always a little amazed at how exploring the small towns we drove through, walking by their rivers, their railroad tracks, standing in their small churches, how much peace it brought him. He was a man from a quieter time, certainly, and I think he felt misplaced a bit in today's world. By my lights, an often facile world, rift with distractions. I know when I reread his books, as I do regularly, I can feel myself slowly becoming less busy. Kinder, I like to think. Certainly more contemplative. When I read Kent's novels, I'm reminded of how, when I was a boy, I literally considered books to be evidential of an afterlife. And I don't mean that metaphorically. What I mean is, when I was a boy, I believed that books not only contained the mind, the imagination, the accumulated dreams and experiences of the man or woman who had written them. I believed that the actual soul of the writer was bound between the covers of the book. And now, again, when we're reading Kent, I find that belief so often reaffirmed. As I said, Kent and I met because of the Mountains and Plains Booksellers event, and it is that organization I have to thank for the last time we got together. October 2013. He was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, and I flew down to Denver, and we all stayed together at Mark and Kathy's home, going to the award ceremony together, as the Haruf family does. And then just a few weeks later, he was diagnosed with interstitial lung disease. And 11 months after that, he was gone from us. kept thinking I'd have time to see him again. I kept fooling myself that he'd get stronger, that he'd be able to see Our Souls at Night published. He wrote, some books are undeservedly forgotten. None are undeservedly remembered. Kent's books will be remembered for their unadorned honesty, for their redemptions, stripped of sentimentality, for their unflinching humanity, for their understanding that eventually all things merge into one. And a river runs through it, runs over the rocks from the basement of time and over the rocks of the words. And so many of the very, very best words were his. Thank you.